Well, hey, we better get started. I've probably got more slides tonight than for any other session, so bear with me if I talk fast. As usual, we'll just start in prayer. Dear Lord, thank you once again for bringing us all together. Thank you again for letting everybody be able to come back. Thank you for the really nice weather. It's great out there. Please bless our time together. Please help us to get home safely, and we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming back. So because of the delay from the snow, this is the second to last session rather than the last. It was supposed to end in time for Mortensen to come, but so you'll just have to deal with his amazing talk and then probably my lesser talk next week. So catching us up from where we were. For anybody who missed last week, so last week we discussed specifically the fossil record and the differences between the views of the secularists and the creationists. We discussed that rapid formation of fossils is actually very possible, and in fact Noah's flood actually provides the impetus for most fossil formation. We then transitioned to talking about the global flood, also sometimes called the global deluge, and that it really was a very real and global event. We discussed the fact that numerous other cultures maintain flood legends, almost certainly because these flood legends, were handed down from all cultures that split at the time of the Tower of Babel. Most importantly, though, we discussed that much of the battle around the origins, whether we're talking secular or Christian, comes down to a lot of time and a little water, the secular view, or a lot of water and a little time, the creationist view. And this is why, as I've emphasized over and over, that Noah's flood is so important and really does explain much of the world we see today, and that denying the existence of this flood is almost as important to secularists as denying a young Earth, because a global flood would completely undermine their evolutionary narrative of uniformitarianism. So they are very threatened by a young Earth, very threatened by a global catastrophic flood, which is why I think it's important to discuss the flood. So tonight, yes? Turn up? Oh, you guys having trouble hearing? Okay, is that better? I'll just chew this thing. All right, that's okay. I don't know who else uses mic with me, but they'll get some of my chapstick. All right, is that perfect? Does that work okay? Is that better? All right. So tonight we want to discuss the logistics of the ark itself, including its construction and its seaworthiness. We want to discuss how the animals got on the ark, lived on the ark, got off the ark, and then spread around the rest of the world. We want to discuss some of the specifics of where the water came from and where it eventually went. And finally, I want to review some of the evidences on Earth that we see today that demonstrate a global flood. So let's turn first to the ark construction itself. So let's talk first about just the massive size of the ark. This really was a massive structure, the capacity of which was not recreated in shipping until the late 1800s. Now, there's a lot of debate over what a cubit is. There are different lengths assigned to various cubits, whether you're talking about the royal cubit or other types of cubits. For the purpose of ark construction and for the purpose of what I'm going to talk about tonight, it has been used as a cubit is 20.4 inches. Using that, which is actually a larger cubit than the traditional cubit, the ark would have been 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet high. The ark was one of the largest wooden ships of all time, and it's roughly equivalent to a modern-sized cargo ship that we see. So we are talking a very, very huge structure. Let's talk first about the seaworthiness of a structure of this size. There was a Korean study done in 1992 investigating these dimensions described in the Bible and compared them to 12 other ships of similar volume, but different heights, lengths, and widths, all trying to achieve the same volume. And they studied these ships in three categories. Number one, comfort at sea. Very important to me and probably my wife. Number two, hull strength. How does the ship itself hold up? And number three, stability. How does the ship do in rough waters? And the Ark was actually an average performer in each category, but It really was one of the best designs overall to balance all three. In fact, modern ships have similar proportionality to what is described in the ark. Why? Because it's a design that works. Side note, did anybody remember the Epic of Gilgamesh from last week that we talked about, where supposedly secularists tell us that Moses stole the flood story? So we were told by secularists that that's where the flood story came from. The boat in the Epic of Gilgamesh looks like this. It's a cube. It has absolutely abysmal seaworthiness. In fact, the Korean study didn't even include it because everybody knew it was so absurd it would just sink to the bottom. So just for comparison, this is Noah's Ark. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Clearly, Moses did not steal this idea from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, turning back to the seaworthiness itself. What they looked at, they wanted to see what kind of waves it could handle, and they determined the ark could handle waves actually up to 98 feet high, and in that sense was a near ideal design. And while the ark was a near ideal design in the Korean study, actually there were some shorter hulls that performed slightly better. However, the Bible tells us that God later sent a wind while the ark was floating atop the sea. And this wind would have produced very large waves, and very large waves would cause ships to tend to breach, meaning turn sideways against the large waves. But if you had a longer hull, as what is described in the Bible, you would probably actually catch that wind and ride the waves like a weather vane, or like my daughter when she claims she can surf. And very likely the ark therefore looked and functioned like a modern ship. So, turning to the ship itself, how long did Noah have to build the ark? This is an interesting question, and AIG's done some interesting math in this area, but Genesis 6:3 tells us that God decided he would destroy man in 120 years. So the clock starts at 120 years. Noah, I'm going to destroy man in 120 years. He also tells us that Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives will all be on the ark. So we can use his sons' ages to help us determine how long he had to build the ark. Shem was Noah's second son, and Shem was 100 years old when he had his first son. That son was born 2 years after the flood, and so we know that Shem was 98 years old when the flood happened. Now, we're not told the difference between the ages of Shem and the third son Ham, but we are told the age difference between Shem and his older brother Japheth is 2 years. So if we roughly assume that same distance, that the third son was about 2 years younger than Shem, this would mean Ham was 96 years old when the flood came. Now, we assume that it takes roughly 20 to 40 years for each son to find a wife, depending on how well groomed he was. And that, then knowing that each of these kids had to be born and find a wife, that would give us roughly somewhere from 55 to 75 years for Noah to actually build the ark. So we think that that's roughly the time frame in which the ark was built. Now, the physical construction of the ark itself likely didn't take too terribly long. Why? If it took the full 120 years to build, part of the ark would have been exposed to all of the elements for the 120 years while you're just finishing this section, and this part would be basically decayed. So likely much of this ark construction was actually spent in planning and researching rather than the actual building itself. Well, the second question then is, who built the ark? And how often have anybody been told there's no way one man could build that entire massive ark? Well, he actually wasn't alone. Recall that he had 3 sons, he had a father, and he had a grandfather. His father Lamech died 5 years before the flood, and his grandfather Methuselah actually died the year of the flood. So he had plenty of help. Noah also could have easily contracted much of the work out after living for 500 years. I assume he invested well and was likely fairly wealthy and could afford it. Items like, for instance, pre-cut wood, or things that he could design to his specification. And Ken Ham, who's the head of AIG, gives a very good analogy and says, look, if 1 or 2 men can construct a house in a matter of a few months, which we see all the time, what could several men do over decades? But wouldn't that take lots of technology? Sure, but what's to say that Noah didn't have technology? Men were living for hundreds of years. That's a lot of time to acquire knowledge and skills. Many of our modern inventions, like concrete, turn out actually to be reinvention of more ancient things. You know, the Romans had concrete. The Egyptians possessed incredible technology to build pyramids a few centuries after the flood. They could saw, they could drill granite. Certainly sawing and drilling wood in Noah's day is not that far of a stretch. If we know the Egyptians could saw and drill granite, I think we can reasonably assume Noah could saw and drill wood a few hundred years before that. Let's look at ancient technology itself. Genesis 4 itself tells us of some of Noah's ancestors. He talks about the time, these are descendants from Adam and Eve, but before Noah. Jubal was the father of those who played string instruments and pipes, implying that string instruments and pipes existed well before the flood. Tubal-Cain, we were told, forged tools of iron and bronze, again telling us that iron and bronze existed well before the flood. And recall what I've told you earlier in this course. We have suffered a significant amount of genetic decay over time. Contrary to what the secularists will tell you, we are probably dumber in our generation than our forefathers, not the opposite way. So genetic decay has corrupted us, and ancient man was likely smarter than modern man. Sorry. There's a happy note. Now, what about an ark of wood? Well, as noted in the last few slides, Noah could have easily had access to important resources to help him construct this wooden ark. He's got plenty of time in 120 years of planning to grow sturdy, large trees that would be required to produce the lumber. He's got plenty of time to create the metals for sawing and drilling. And he's got plenty of time to put together basic technology like winches, pulleys, ropes, cranes, things that are all very, very feasible back then. Now, if you go back to the King James Version, we're told that the ark was made of gopher wood. We don't actually know what gopher wood is, and it's never actually mentioned again in the Bible. So it could have been some sort of tree that couldn't survive the post-flood world. We don't know for sure. However, there's an interesting theory from a man named Tim Lovett who thinks that actually gopher wood is probably some sort of pine. And pine works well because it grows at high elevations, which is where Noah would have likely constructed the ark, and I'll come back to why in just a second. But pine is a very solid wood, good for ships, and more importantly, pine helps produce something called pitch, which is very important to ark construction and is specifically mentioned in the ark construction. So what is pitch? Well, God also instructed Noah to cover the ark, both inside and out, which is a little bit unique with pitch. Pitch is a gum-based resin that comes from certain trees like pine trees. And it does a couple of things. Number one, it provides water resistance. Very, very important. But equally important, it actually acts as a preservative. And this would have allowed Noah several years to build an ark, especially if he was applying extra amounts of pitch both to the inside and the outside as God conveniently instructed. But can you really build a wooden ship that big? And this is one of the biggest criticisms that secularists will level at the ark, is that it's difficult to build a wooden ship that big. Now, traditional wooden ships are built on what's called a carvel hull, which is pictured here. And you see the ship construction where basically you lay out the mold, if you will, underneath, and then you lay your wood across here and create the ship. This is obviously the bottom of the ship for those like me who don't have good geometric ability to think through that. And the leakiness was determined by the strength of the caulk or the glue that connects these things. So you don't leak directly through the wood. You leak right here in the cracks between the wood. And so the leakiness is determined by what caulk or glue you use to put those wood beams together. And even if you applied straps, which was technology figured out later, and you try to pull the whole together, the maximum length of ships that they could make in the 1800s and 1900s out of wood was about 330 feet because of this problem. Now, but we're told the ark is 510 feet, which is much larger than we were able to build in the 1800s and 1900s. Well, how do you reconcile this? So is a wooden ark impossible? Well, number one, let's talk about wood itself. Wood actually is a good building material and very good for ships. It has a solid weight to strength ratio, meaning it doesn't weigh that much for how much strength you get. The limiting factor, as I mentioned, is the way those planks are put together, not the wood itself. So it's not the wooden ship that's limiting, it's how did you put those planks together. And so using that traditional carvel hull construction, the ark would be impossible. But that's likely not how the ark was built. So let's look at some other possibilities. First of all, diagonal planking. And this is using multiple diagonal planks, and actually the U.S. Navy figured this out around the time they were struggling with this, and it was used in PT boats. Actually also used in British ships in the 1800s, and so you see you've got planks going one way and planks going another way, which significantly decreases the leakiness. What about mortise and tenon planking? Interestingly, this is a really interesting story. This was actually discovered on Greek and Roman ships dating back to 1400 BC. But the technology seems to be lost around 500 AD, and it was only recently rediscovered. Again, arguing that ancient man in many ways had better technology and better smarts than we do today. They were using this technology several centuries BC, and we just recently rediscovered it. What they do is they cut holes in the planks themselves. The planks are the long wooden strips that go along there. And they insert a small piece of wood called a tenon and then seal it with a dowel. So you can see here you've got your planks of wood. You cut a hole in the top called the mortise with a hole, and then you insert this thing called the tenon into the hole, and then you push a dowel in there. And this seals this stuff very, very well together. And and this is why there are descriptions of ancient ships other than the ark exceeding the quote-unquote so-called limit of 330 feet. How about multiple layers? Well, that's pretty simple. That's pretty effective. The Chinese actually used this, and they used it for their treasure ships in the 1400s. What they did is they just added a layer every year. They didn't bother reconstructing anything. They just threw another layer on to protect it, and their ships got to be 450 feet in length. Actually, Greek and Roman ships used this same technology as well. There's something called edge bolting, which is actually a simpler version of mortise and tenon, and maybe a better explanation for what was used in the ark. But around AD 500, iron spikes were used instead of that mortise and tenon because it was so much easier to drill an iron spike straight down than to do the intricate wood carving. But either way, it's the same idea. Again, you are using something to bolt each of the planks together. What about bulkheads? So the use of ribs in the ship, the ribs are those planks that come around and look like ribs. Bulkheads are great stabilizing forces. Well, what's a bulkhead? I hear it in the airplane all the time. And these are simply upright walls that separate areas of the ship. This would represent a bulkhead separating the ship. And this provides a whole lot of stability to the ship itself. It also comes with unique bonus features. For example, being very useful if you need, separate multiple animals in different compartments. It's kind of convenient. So how do we launch the ark? And this is what I was talking about before about where Noah probably constructed the ark. Very likely, the early flood, if you were on the ocean, was probably incredibly devastating. If you were at all near sea level, you'd have massive tsunamis, torrential rain, and this would probably destroy any ship that was built at that level. So how does the ark avoid that problem? Well, you launch from the tallest point. By then, the waters have built up so much that they're likely calmer and enable a smoother launch. Additionally, as I mentioned, if gopher wood is a pine, it grows well at altitude. So likely, the ark was constructed at altitude using probably pine because it could produce the pitch and grew well there, and allowed Noah to launch his ark from where he wanted. Now, a couple additional thoughts. Tim Lovett, the gentleman I mentioned earlier from AIG, postulates a couple interesting ideas about how the ark was constructed. He thinks it was probably placed on some sort of stone structure, as this would actually aid in holding the weight of the ark and protect it from the initial earthquakes that probably happened early in the flood. Think of things like Stonehenge that sit upright, these big, massive stones that sit up there. Probably something similar was used for the ark, and clearly we know ancients had the technology to do it since we all see Stonehenge. He also proposes 3 keels, or feet, for the ark. And those are these right here. Here's 1 keel, 2 keel, and the 3rd keel's on the other side. And these would be good because they would act as absorbers of tremor. They'd reduce rolling in the waves, and they would keep the ark pointed in one direction. Additionally, they could help resist abrasion as the ark breached and hit land. So again, that's pure conjecture. That's not in the Bible, but that is a design feature demonstrated on the ark itself. Not Noah's Ark, the ark that AIG built, and this is obviously a picture of that. So, conclusions on construction. Obviously, there was plenty of time, material, and knowledge to build the ark. And God probably also provided additional instructions to Noah that aren't included in the Genesis account. We don't know that for sure, but it certainly seems would make sense. There were plenty of people around who could help Noah with the construction. And there are many proposed mechanisms for constructions of a durable wooden ark. Clearly, the ark was a seaworthy vessel that could survive a global flood. Before animals, any questions on construction? Perfect. I knew you'd all get it. Yes, ma'am. No, I mean, that's a good question. Do we even need it to be that seaworthy was the question. And that's a fair question. I think you probably still do, because as we'll talk about here to some degree, the flood was a pretty violent event, and you still do have a lot of catastrophic waves and whatnot. But you're right. You're not dealing with the stuff you would deal with at a low level there. And so do you need a perfect seaworthy vessel? No, probably not, but it certainly helps. And the other thing is you want a seaworthy vessel so people aren't vomiting the entire time they're on the ship. So... What's that? Yeah, or the 8 of them. Yeah, they didn't lose anybody. All right. So let's talk about animals. So as we talked about last week, when people talk about Noah's Ark, they often picture a really large bathtub or a canoe with giraffes sticking their heads out, or their necks. But as we talked about before, this really does a disservice to the miracle of God's rescue of the animals. And in reality, the ark was a life-saving structure for every animal that breathed air in its nostrils. So here are the questions we need to answer. How many animals actually were on the ark? How were these animals fed and watered? How did those animals spread out after the flood ended? And what about the fish and the marine life? So let's talk first about one of the most important concepts when we're having these discussions. And it's something I've mentioned many times, but I've kind of saved it for this discussion. It's the importance of kinds. And I'm going to explain what that is, but modern classification schemes break organisms into classifications based on what we probably all learned in high school biology, the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and work our way down. But that classification system didn't exist at the time the Bible was written, and importantly, is a man-made invention. The Bible refers to animals differently. The Bible refers to animals, quote, according to their kind. And kind is a broader term that probably exists at the family level, so much higher up than genus and species. And in general, kind is best thought of, I think the simplest way, is animals that can breed together. So a horse and a zebra are of the same kind because they can breed together. A dog and a wolf are of the same kind. They can breed together. Now, using a different type of evolution, word evolution, this has created some confusion over this matter. So, creation scientists like to use the word baramen to discuss this. Bara means created, men means kind. Created kinds, baramen. And that's how they classify animals. And this term is very useful and avoids the confusion of genus and species that I'm going to talk about here. The Latin translation in the Old Testament used both genus and species to replace what was the Hebrew term for kind. So the Hebrews had the term kind. When it was being translated into Latin, the Latin interchangeably used genus and species. Later, Christians then began to discuss, quote, the fixity of species, meaning that one species does not evolve into another, an important concept and something that we've talked about earlier as well. But this created a problem, as we see changing species all the time. The dog and wolf probably came from a common ancestor. What Christians actually meant is there is fixity of kinds, i.e., we don't see a dog becoming a cat. And this is an important distinction that secularists will often use to attack creationists. So, looking at the dog species, these creatures are all of the same kind, but they're not of the same species by modern classification. Again, modern man-made classification uses the term species to differentiate a wolf, a dingo, a coyote, a collie. But the creationist would say these are all of a single baramin. These are all of a single created kind. And kind, unfortunately, was translated both genus and species, leading to this confusion. Does that make sense? Do you follow where the problem is? So this goes back to what we talked about much, much earlier at the beginning of this course. You can remember back that far, is microevolution versus macroevolution. So probably the original kind ancestor of the dog kind probably had an incredible amount of genetic material that slowly decayed into these various creatures that we see in this picture. So why is this important to Noah's flood? Well, it's very different logistically if you only need to bring one pair of each baramin or kind than if you need to bring a pair of each modern species. In other words, do you need to bring 2 red wolves, 2 gray wolves, 2 Dobermans, 2 collies, 2 coyotes, etc., or do you need to bring one pair of a common ancestor of the dog-wolf kind? And I would argue that it is the latter, making this much simpler. So, knowing that, how many animals did Noah need to bring? Well, current estimates are that there are fewer than 1.8 million species of organisms in the world. And 98% of these are actually fish, invertebrates, plants, animals, trees. And this leaves about 34,000 land-dwelling vertebrates that would need to be on the ark. However, a lot of those are of the same kind. So Answers in Genesis has done some really excellent work in classifying kinds and estimating how many of each would need to be on the ark. And they did this with very conservative estimates to try to make it as believable as possible. So they assume 14 of every clean animal and bird rather than 7. So recall, based on the translation or how you read the Bible, that Noah was to take either 7 of every clean animal and bird or 7 pairs. Depends on the translation. They said, let's be conservative. Let's assume it was 7 pairs for every one of those, so it's 14 for every one of those animals. They put animals into the same kind only if they definitely belong there. For example, all bats may very well be of the same kind, but they decided there are roughly 24 families of bats, and there isn't enough evidence to prove that they're all of one kind, so they took the more conservative route and said, fine, we will assume they're those 24, and therefore there are over 300 bats on the ark. This is a table showing how they came up with these numbers. But basically, they marched through here and they said, okay, for the amphibians, we think there's 54 kinds, 2 per kind, 108. For the reptiles, same thing, non-mammal synapsids. Then mammals themselves, and they broke this down into clean and flying, or unclean, that don't need quite as many. Birds, the flying birds and the flightless birds. And then they said, okay, these are all the kinds that we see in the fossil record. What do we see in the non-fossil record? In other words, what's around today? And they did the same thing and multiplied it all out. What they came up with was 1,373 kinds, multiplied by the appropriate numbers gives you 6,658 animals on the ark. But can you fit 6,700 animals on the ark? Well, number one, we all picture huge hippos and big giraffes with long necks. That really doesn't make sense. You would take small babies onto the ark for two reasons. Number one, they're smaller and easier to care for. Number two, these are the things that are going to repopulate the earth. No grandpa giraffe is going to be repopulating the earth. So you need to bring the juvenile ones. And Answers in Genesis actually projects that 85% of the animals were under 22 pounds, and the vast majority were under the size of a beagle. So again, we all picture the common zoo animals, but the vast majority of animals that were on the ark were actually very small. Now the ark size, we talked about how big the ship was. How much space does that give us? About the same space as 450 semi-trucks. So the common picture of a small boat with huge animals sticking their heads out and whatnot is likely not what actually happened. When thought of as the way I've described, the numbers I've described become much more realistic. Animals in their cages really would have only taken up about half the space on the ark, leaving a lot of room for food, water, human space, etc. But those animals, they gotta eat. So, knowing the number of animals, the average size, the presumed metabolic rates, the Answers in Genesis researchers created a minimum of 17,125 cubic feet of food needed. This is 400 tons of food. So they needed this many cubic feet. This is how many cubic feet existed on the ark. No problem. Now, it's unclear if there were actually carnivores on the ark. We've talked about this before, but once the ark rested, it became more clear that vegetarianism was over at that point, and the Bible explicitly states that. But we don't know if animals on the ark were actually carnivores or not, or if they became carnivores after the flood. But even if there were carnivores, meat can be preserved in a number of ways: drying, pickling, salting, smoking. Some fish actually can pack themselves in the mud and survive for years without water. Also, mealworms can be used. And for every other animal, there's grasses, grains, seeds, nuts, dried vegetables, and fruits to be used. But those animals need to drink. Water was likely solved by a combination of techniques. This probably included bringing cisterns of water on board, but also probably large storage areas on top of the ark that could collect the rainwater. We know there's going to be a lot of water. Why not use it? And actually, bamboo works very well as a piping mechanism. And recall that ancient man was actually pretty complex, and there were probably other piping options available. Each cage could easily have its own vacuum-controlled distribution system, much like we see with rabbit feeders today and other caged animals. These are very simple systems that could easily water the animals. But those animals poop a lot. So the estimates from the AIG is that the ark would have produced a few tons of, let's call it, waste each day. And this creates a lot of work, but with 8 workers, it's actually manageable. On top of that, various creative solutions like slope deck with bamboo chutes for collecting liquid waste are possible, and I'll show you a picture of this. Also, probably, animals were not given straw bedding. This, while it would make the animals more comfortable, they could have survived without the straw bedding for the time frame we're talking about on the ark, and this would significantly reduce the difficulties with cleaning. So those of you who have owned certain animals know that when you give them bases to do things on, it becomes much more messy, but if you take those away, it's much simpler. So carefully designed animal transfer cages for dangerous animals could have allowed cleaning of one cage while the animal was held in another smaller cage. So for example, this is something they propose as a cleaning mechanism for small animals. Basically, there are small holes in each of these cages that allows the waste to drop down in the hole onto this sloped ramp that then falls all the way down here to another slope ramp and becomes easy to clean. You've got multiple animals here all eating and pooping, and we're able to clean it up fairly simply. What about a moon pool? So Answers in Genesis proposes the use of a moon pool, and I think this makes a lot of sense. These are open cavities within the ship, that go from the top to the bottom, basically. And these allow two things. Number one, ventilation, to help the odors get better. Helps fight disease and helps keep the air clean, but also can be used as a safe way to dispose of wastewater. And actually, these moon pools probably would create stability in rough seas. So what you have here in this demonstration is you have animals in various cages, and you've got the piping system for wastewater, which dumps into here and via a pulley system goes up and dumps out into the ocean itself. So this is a cutaway, but this would all be covered in wood, but open up to here. The water never gets this high, but we're roughly at the water level here, and you dump the water into the ocean. That allows ventilation and allows us to get rid of waste. So once the animals got off the ark, how exactly did they spread out? So when the ark finally came to rest, it was among the mountains of Ararat, which likely is in western Turkey and eastern Iran. Recall again, the animals on the ark were baramen, or created kinds, and they were likely full of genetic material that they could diversify into the subsequent species. Recall also that God created everything perfect, and once again it is likely, as hard as it is for us to accept, genetic material is decaying over time, a topic I've talked about before called genetic entropy. And this is a large part of how we get the speciation we see today. A single cat kind, as it spread out to different environments, became lions and tigers, and I don't know why I wrote pattas, but lynxes and even house cats. But how did those animals get to faraway places like Australia? There's actually several ways animals could have traveled distances separated by water. There actually were probably numerous floating logs left over from devastated forests, and these logs could be carried great distance by ocean currents. And it's likely that some of the animals could have gotten on these logs and spread out. It's also equally likely that humans like pets and took some of them with them as the humans themselves spread out. They also could have used land bridges. We've heard a lot about land bridges, and I'll come back to that, but one interesting theory about why Australia is so dominated by marsupials and why they're so dominant there is that because they were able to carry their young in their pouches, so the marsupials are things like kangaroos, they were able to travel a lot farther and faster than those that had to stop and care for their young. Therefore, marsupials probably arrived to Australia before any other animal and were able to dominate there where they weren't in other areas. But aren't those ideas just conjecture? Sure, but they have a lot of good evidence. Actually, secularists will tell us that there was a land bridge between the Bering Strait, and that's how the Native Americans got to North America. So even in secular beliefs, we're told that land bridges were a thing. There was a famous eruption on the island of Krakatoa in 1883. It destroyed everything. But within about a year, there were actually grasses and insects. And within a few decades, there were hundreds of species. So clearly, animals can spread across water, even to an island that was destroyed. So what about the fish and the marine life? Well, for the most part, this is fairly obvious and isn't a huge issue as water's perfect for them. And so a giant flood for most of them is not a major issue. But there still is one problem, and that's the mixing of salt water and fresh water. Very likely, the flood made the oceans much saltier, which makes sense. The flood took massive amounts of sediment back into the ocean and probably led to increasing saltiness. In addition, volcanic eruptions spewed a ton of minerals into the air that would have made the oceans more salty. And so clearly, because of some of this mixing, because of the flood, many marine animals died. As I told you before, 95% of the fossil record is marine life, and a great number of what we find in the fossil record are already extinct. So what about the adaptability of marine life? Well, fish aren't quite as finicky as we picture, and they're actually pretty adaptable and can transition environments of varying salinity. So salmon, striped bass, and some trout, as well as Atlantic sturgeon, actually move from seawater to freshwater to spawn, and then they go home. Eels actually do the exact opposite. They go from freshwater and then they get into seawater to spawn. Now, not all fish are this adaptable, but turning back to baramen, created kinds, it's likely fish had DNA that could code for the ability to survive in either fresh water or salt water, and the expression of that DNA probably changed post-flood. And today we actually see fish of the same type living in both freshwater and saltwater. For example, but these are all considered different species by man-made classification, but they're the same kind. So we've got freshwater salmon and seawater salmon, and same with herring and catfish and flatfish and toadfish and clingfish, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what about the conditions during the flood as it relates to water? Well, massive raining on the land would have quickly overwhelmed the lakes, the rivers, and caused flooding into the ocean. And this would actually, interestingly, create little freshwater reserves called haloclenes on top of the ocean where maybe some freshwater fish could survive. And these actually likely persisted for a fair amount of time, depending on the water movements. Keep in mind also that a lot of marine life survive via the use of eggs, and eggs would be far less sensitive to the flood conditions, and once the environment calmed down, these hatchlings could then develop normally. So, while a great deal of marine life clearly perished in the flood, there are very plausible explanations of how a great deal survived. And once again, the adaptability of created kinds likely explains much of what we see in marine life today. And those that could not adapt, that's what we find in the fossils. So, concluding the animal logistics, there were clearly a large number of animals on the ark. However, these numbers are both manageable and realistic given the recorded sizes of the ark and the manpower available on the ark. The importance of baramin, or created kinds, really helps explain how those animals spread out and adapted to new environments. And though life was rough for marine animals, their survival is fairly easily explained. Questions on animals? All right. So, turning to the water itself. Well, first, where did all the water come from? It's actually important to realize that water didn't cover our modern Earth. And this is one of the most fundamental things to explain to secularists. They look at the modern Earth and they say, well, how could that all be flooded? Well, the reality is most of what we see on modern Earth was created by the flood. So, in other words, we didn't have Mount Everest until after the flood. The created Earth was likely much more flat, shorter mountains, and it was the movement of the continents during the flood that caused the lifting of the mountains. Remember, secondly, that the flood itself covered the highest mountains, meaning the highest mountains at the time, by about 20 to 25 feet. And as I told you last week, looking at the modern ocean, if we actually were to bring up the current oceans from their depths and bring down the mountains and make everything flat, what would happen? The Earth is covered in water a mile and a half deep. So there's clearly plenty of water left on Earth, even post-flood, to see how it could have easily covered the Earth. Now, the Bible tells us there were two sources of the water. First, the windows of heaven were opened, and the fountains of the great deep were broken up, from Genesis 7:11. Likely, the majority of the water came from this second category, from the fountains of the deep, as clouds alone couldn't hold enough water to cover the earth. However, these fountains of the deep would be constantly generating new clouds, new sources of water, to allow for new rainfall. Now, the windows of heaven is a very interesting phrase, and we don't know exactly what it means. Does it mean exactly rain clouds? Does it mean something supernatural? But it's probably more of an expression, if you will, because we turn to Malachi 3:10, and God discussed that we can test him by tithing regularly and see if he doesn't open, quote, the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing until it overflows. So it's probable, or possible I should say, but I think probable, that windows of heaven simply means an abundance of something. Or, again, it could be some sort of miraculous source. What about the fountains of the great deep? As we talked about briefly last week, the earth was probably a single continent initially, and then as water came up from the fountains of the deep, it drove those continents apart. And in fact, it probably was the initial breaking apart of the large continents which caused the floods. When you break this apart, you cause massive continental shift and movement, and all the crust underneath would cause volcanic activity that would then probably create the flood. So I actually think that it was probably the breaking up of the continents, supernaturally designed by God, that actually caused the flood itself. Now, as these continents moved and collided, it forced the rising of mountains. So in fact, Mount Everest still rises slightly every year from these movements. Continental shift theories associated with the flood are actually very similar, as I told you before, to secular theories, except the flood theory explains this thing happening much faster and at the time of the flood than the secularists who tell us this was a very slow and incremental shift of tectonic plates. Again, this comes back to the theme I opened with, which is a lot of time and a little water, or a lot of water and a little time. Excuse me. Also, the thick layers and fossil prevalence of a massive amount of marine fossils in the Grand Canyon is far better explained by a catastrophic and rapid continental shift than by slow and incremental shift. So we have all the water. Where did it all go? Well, that's fairly straightforward. It's in the ocean and lakes we see today. Remember, 3/4 of the Earth's surface is covered in water. And actually, as the ocean floor cooled, again, I skipped over this fast, but probably when the continents broke apart, it caused a lot of subterranean volcanic activity that probably heated the oceans. More on that next week. But as the ocean floors cooled, they would have actually sank and allows the ocean basins to become bigger and collect this receding water. Meanwhile, the land rose with the formation of mountains, and plateaus, like the Colorado Plateau in which Grand Canyon is carved, were actually lifted out of the water by these shifts. Now, some creationists feel that Psalm 104 refers to all of these events and describes it fairly well. You covered the earth with watery depths. The waters stood above the mountains, but at your rebuke the waters fled. They flowed over the mountains, they went down into the valleys to the place you assigned for them. Never again will they cover the earth. Lastly, on the water, has anybody heard of the canopy model before? Or heard of this? So this is a long-standing theory that was developed in the 1960s from creationists that Earth initially was created with a quote-unquote canopy of water around it. And it's unclear in this canopy model if this is a solid, liquid, or gas form of water, but the thought is that this canopy was released at the time of the flood. This was likely a storehouse of a significant amount of water. And the theory was that this canopy actually created a much better environment for life. It blocked harmful radiation, and this is part of why the patriarchs lived so much longer than modern man. The theory also included the idea that it didn't rain on the earth until after the flood, which is why we don't see rainbows until after the flood. And we lived in more of a dew-like environment every morning rather than actual rain or storms. I still personally think this is a very good theory, and I like it. There are some reasons that it may not be the best theory. Now, there are two sides to this argument on the creationist side, and I'm not going to marry myself to one or the other, but I just mentioned that's sort of the pro-argument. The anti-argument is that a lot of people have moved away from this. For one, it's just because it's not actually stated in the Bible, and it is sort of man inventing something and putting it in there. Also, the canopy probably would have obstructed views of the stars, which seems contradictory to why God created them, which was as a map at night. Finally, these waters above heaven are mentioned in the Bible post-flood. In other words, it's not just mentioned before the flood that there are waters above heaven, it's mentioned post-flood, and that canopy was supposed to have disappeared. From a scientific standpoint, a canopy would have created significant temperature issues for the Earth, a very, very extreme greenhouse effect, and that would have increased the partial pressure of oxygen in the environment, which actually would have led to so much oxygen it probably would have had detrimental effects that may have outweighed the benefits in terms of longevity for mankind. So in conclusion, the massive amount of water came from both above and below. The water could have easily covered the Earth, and I think we've shown that fairly clearly. The water then receded and exists in the oceans and lakes today, and this massive water likely accounts for the continental shifts and the formation of the mountains. So finally, I want to talk about some evidences for the flood itself. Well, number one, how about sea creatures at really high altitudes? So we find fossils at really high levels, like the Kaibab limestone layer of the Grand Canyon, which is 7,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level. Fossilized ammonites, which is pictured here, They've actually been discovered in limestone layers in the Himalayas. That's 30,000 feet above sea. The oceans had to be that high at some point. How about the rapid burial of creatures? I don't know if any of you have heard of fossil graveyards, but these are things, one of the best examples is found in the Green River Formation in Wyoming. It contains a mix of fish, alligators, birds, turtles, mammals, insect, palm leaves, all buried together. If we all had this happen very slowly over millions of years, how can this possibly be explained? It is much better explained by very rapid burial via a flood. We showed last week, I showed you pictures of fossils that died while eating other animals, or that while they were giving birth. I showed you a fossil of a jellyfish. Remember that jellyfish outside of water decay incredibly quickly. The only way we can have a fossil of a jellyfish is if it had very rapid burial. And we see exquisite preservation of things like fins and eye sockets that, again, suggest very rapid burial. It's very hard to explain this kind of very rapid burial outside of a flood model. What about massive burials? There's an interesting collection of something called straight-shelled nautiloids. They're within this 7-layer thickness of the red wall limestone in the Grand Canyon, and it stretches for about 180 miles and covers 10,500 square miles. To get that kind of collection over that kind of time would require 24 cubic miles of lime, sand, and silt flowing at 16 feet per second. What other than a massive flood could explain that? Also, we've got rapidly deposited and uniform sedimentary layers. So we talked last week about the layers in the rocks. And these layers of sedimentary rock exposed at the Grand Canyon are found fairly uniformly across the United States and elsewhere. For example, that lowest layer called the top eight sandstone covers much of the United States. Limestone contained in the red wall limestone is seen in Pennsylvania and Tennessee in the exact same position in the strata sequences with the same fossils. And even more impressively, those same layers and fossils are found all the way over in England. Very, very hard to explain this from a uniformitarianism model. Chalk beds in southern England, they create these incredible white cliffs. And those same beds with the same stratofossils are found elsewhere in Europe, Middle East, and elsewhere, Nebraska. That stretches all the way to here, actually. Again, only a massive global flood could have laid down such consistent strata across the globe. Finally, there's no erosion between these rock layers. Look how flat and rapidly transitioned the layers are here. If each layer was laid down over millions of years, we should see evidence of erosion. And we don't. We see very flat, uniform layers that transition immediately from this to this to this to this without any evidence of any kind of erosion. You could draw a straight line along there. Again, it doesn't fit a uniformitarianism model. It fits a catastrophism model around a flood. I've brought this up before, but I still think this is one of the best arguments, are the bent rock layers. You cannot bend solid rock. You cannot bend solid concrete. But you can bend wet concrete no problem. So if the lower layers here, we're told, were laid down millions of years before the upper layers, exactly how did all the layers of bend? Clearly, they all had to bend together while still wet. This cannot be laid down slowly over time. So finally, looking at the flood in general, the account in Genesis is not some poetic allegory. It's a historical account of a real and literal event. We've shown how preservation of life on the ark was both feasible and believable. We talked about the logistics of the water movement and how this would affect construction of the earth we see today, including the mountains, canyons, and fossils, and how this earth differed from the pre-flood earth. Again, contrast everything I've explained to you with the very slow uniformitarianism process that secularists adhere to, and ask which makes more sense. A lot of time and a little water, or a lot of water and a little time. Next week I'll finally be done. So I'm gonna wrap this up, and I'm gonna focus on some additional miscellaneous areas, frequently asked questions about the age of the earth, and then I'm gonna very briefly review the whole series, and then wrap it up with the compromise theories, like God-directed evolution. And we'll talk finally about how we might interpret Genesis. having said that last week is my last week, it actually is not. Pastor Cleve twisted my arm because he didn't want a 2-week break between this class and the other classes that are starting. So I am going to do one more talk 2 weeks from now, not on this topic. I'm going to talk about what I do for a living, which is cardiology. So I have a talk that I give to the general public about cardiology, what's a heart attack, what's heart failure, what are heart rhythm issues. I assume I'll see an older audience than a younger audience for that. But you are all invited to come to that as well. So I'm going to give that talk 2 weeks from now. So if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Don't all jump at once, though. I did. Yeah. Well, again, we don't know for sure if carnivores existed, but I don't. You would assume that they would pack enough for a longer. I don't think they knew. Well, maybe God told Noah this is how much food you're going to have. There's still plenty of space on the ark for food after they leave the ark, but presumably by the time the dove could go out and find the olive, or not the dove. Yeah, was it the dove? The olive branch. Find the olive branch, we have to assume that that means olive trees were growing by then and we're starting to see food being produced. So I don't think you need a whole lot more time beyond that. Yes, sir. That's a good question. I struggled with that for a while. I think what happened was the continent shifted apart, which caused a lot of volcanic eruptions that actually reshaped the ocean. And then as the ocean cooled, it actually allowed the sinking of the ocean deeper than it was to start. So that's the explanation I've read on that. Yeah. Yeah, so hibernation I didn't discuss specifically. That is one theory that's out there, is that I didn't go into that, and AIG specifically did not use that because they thought it was too easy of a cop-out and they wanted to show that it was possible even if they weren't hibernating. But yes, there is probably a pretty good likelihood that a fair number of the animals were hibernating, and that was part of it too. I, again, specifically didn't include that because I wanted to make it as difficult, if you will, as possible, but yes, that is another explanation. Yes, sir. I think it's about 150 days, I think, before it came to rest. And then after it rested, I'd have to go back and look, but I think the Genesis account is fairly clear. I think it's roughly a year or so that they were on the ark, roughly, before they could come off. Good. Did you have a question, ma'am? Yeah. So that question, so I contemplated putting that into my FAQ section. Answers in Genesis has an excellent explanation of that and why that's not when the continents differentiated. I have to go back and read their explanation again to give you an answer to that, but that has been looked at, and it is not thought that that is the time at which continental shift occurred. But it doesn't say, that's not what the Bible says there. You have to read it in a slightly different context. I'll have to go back and read AIG's explanation, but yeah, that's not what the Bible is saying at that time. They're referring more to the way peoples separated at that time, they don't mean the literal continents of the earth, is the short answer. Good. Any other questions? Oh yes, sir. Yeah, so I avoided that because it's controversial. There are some people who think they've found the ark. The position of Answers in Genesis, which I think is probably the correct one, is we probably will never find the exact ark for several reasons. Number one, to answer part of your question, they may have used it for firewood right after they came off the ark. Number two, that it probably would have degenerated quite a bit in that amount of time. So while some people think they may have discovered the site, in fact, my dad sent me a good video on this. I've still got to look into it more. There are some people who think they found it. I didn't go into that specifically. Very good. So speaking of my dad, if any of you are interested about why I got into this, my parents were nice enough to come today, so that's why I was a little late getting here. I had to pick them up from the airport, but they're here for Grandparents' Day, so they can probably answer any questions that you have better than I can. All right. All right. Very good. Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope I'll see you next week.